At this point in the season, which is pretty late into summer, right? We're getting closer into fall. We are in mid-August right now. And are your tomatoes ripening? Because mine aren't. That's what we're going to talk about today, why tomatoes can take a long time to ripen. Because they don't always do, but under certain conditions, this can happen. So if you have been following my channel, you know that the only type of tomato that I grow is the Amish Paste, right? It fits what I like to use it for. It seems to be a really nice multi-purpose tomato that doesn't produce a lot of juice and can be really good for cooking. So this is the type of tomato that I grow. But tomatoes not ripening can be not just specific to variety, right? There can be certain varieties that can be a lot more sensitive to it than other varieties. And it seems that the Amish Paste is definitely one of the many varieties that are relatively sensitive to it. So we have typically three main problems that can cause tomatoes to stay green on the vine and not ripen. First off is not enough sun. Like if you have not enough cloudy days or just too much shade for the tomatoes, they're not going to ripen up, at least not ripen up as quickly. Because photosynthesis is important, right? To produce those sugars and sweeten the fruit up, access to sunlight is important for that. Because that is how the glucose is made, right? It's the building block basically for all those different carbon-based compounds. The other issue that could be at play here is it could be too cold. Now that is definitely not a problem that we're having right now. In mid-August, we are in the middle of a heat wave, right? But sometimes later in the season, when we can get nights going down into the 50s, low 50s or below 50s, we can run into issues with altering those biochemical processes that may inhibit the ripening of some of these fruits, right? And so around that time then, it's usually a good idea, especially if you're talking about frosty conditions and stuff, to go in and harvest all those green tomatoes. That's what I do at the end of the season or near the end of the season, and harvest all those green tomatoes, bring them inside, put them in paper bags, or even just put them in stack them in dishes and put them out on the counter, and they'll ripen like that too. You just have to be careful with the stems so the stems don't puncture the other tomatoes. So you can de-stem them or just organize them gently. So like I said, we are in a heat wave right now, and especially this later in the season when we typically are starting to get a little bit more cooler weather, that's not happening, right? So all these tomatoes are hanging on the vines, and they are remaining green for a long period of time. They've been on the vine for multiple weeks, probably almost, maybe not quite a month, but they've sized up and everything. They look great, they're just not turning color. So we have different biochemical processes that can really factor into this, right? They can be affected by light access, by temperature, by nutrient access. Certain nutrients can play a key role in helping to promote certain plants to be more heat tolerant. So we have many different specific things that can contribute to tomatoes not ripening, but they can usually be generalized into these three categories. For example, if the soil gets too hot or too cold, it really kind of traumatizes that, or shifts anyway, or shuts down a lot of that microbiological community in the soil that would otherwise form the relationships with the plants and help get nutrient access, right, to those plants. And if that's not happening, that can affect those biochemical cycles, and the tomatoes may not ripen, right? So just kind of things like that we can kind of put together in our minds and kind of understand how all this can kind of contribute and relate to tomatoes not ripening. So if you are experiencing temperature issues related to tomatoes not ripening, particularly if it's too hot, which is what I'm going to kind of focus on here because that's the issue that I have right now, we're kind of limited in what we can do. But there are some important steps to take that can help to reduce the stress on those plants, and you may be able to help the tomatoes ripen a little bit faster possibly. First off, what I generally do is I make sure the plants are getting enough water, right? Especially during a heat wave when it gets hot, it can most likely get dry soon after, and it'll be important to keep those tomato plants watered, right? Not just so that they get water to keep the plants alive and healthy, which is important, but also so that it cools down that soil where those roots are growing, right? And because water has a very high specific heat, it takes a lot of energy to heat up water, right? So it's going to be resistant and help the soil warm up more slowly. And so that can kind of provide a temperature buffer for the microbiology and the tomato roots in the soil. Just like when we're outside or we're doing work and we get hot and sweaty and tired, and we go back inside and we get a glass of water and you can feel it just cools you down, and you feel a lot better. After I water, I like to try to mulch, right? I try to apply a pretty good sized mulch. And actually what the mulch can do is it can further buffer, provide more of that dead airspace between the watered soil and the hot air above ground, right? And so it helps kind of provide a bit of a temperature shield in that dead airspace, but also it helps keep that water in the soil for a longer period of time so it doesn't just evaporate, right? That water has to be taken up by the plant and be transpired out of the plant, which is typically a slower process than just evaporating right up out of the ground, right? So the mulch helps kind of facilitate the holding of that water in that soil. It can also contribute organic matter and nutrients as well over time, so it's just generally a good idea. The other thing is if it's really hot, and if you've ever stood in the sun, you heat up really fast, right? It feels really hot. But if you stand in the shade, it feels, multiple degrees colder, right? Cooler. So shade can really help, right? So one thing I did last year that's actually kind of seemed to work, I guess, was I had incrementally planted, I was incrementally growing sumac in some of these garden beds, right? So it kind of gave that incremental shade, and so some of these tomatoes would get shaded out for a portion of the day at least, where as the sun would move across the sky, the shadows from the sumac would move, and so it would cast that shade over different tomato plants during the course of the day. And I think that was really kind of beneficial. I don't recall having too many issues of tomatoes not ripening fast or not ripening at a speed that they normally would. Also maybe the weather patterns were a little different last year, but we also had a drought too late in the season, and I think there were some accompanying heat waves with that too. But this year I'm growing those tomatoes in a different area of the garden, actually a smaller garden, not in the main one that's behind me, and it is in full sun pretty much all day. And so that could kind of be playing into this issue of making it worse and more intense and preventing these tomatoes from ripening. Alternatively, if the tomatoes are already being grown in a sunny location and it's kind of late in the season, shade cloth or even some sort of sheet might be able to be used to help kind of reduce some of that sunlight, right, and reduce that immediate heat that some of those tomato plants are going to be exposed to. Obviously, that's more of a small scale solution. If tomatoes are being grown on a larger scale or on like a farm, it might not always necessarily be quite as useful in that way, but for the home gardener, it might be applicable. The other thing that's generally a good practice anyway is to make sure we are trimming certain parts of the tomato plant, right? Maybe not necessarily all of the big leaves so much, because those might be important for helping the plant to make the most of its photosynthesis, but also to kind of provide some shade for surrounding plants or for itself, for its own root system. So we'll want to be judicious with what leaves we're taking. Usually I'll try to trim the bottommost leaves that are touching the ground, because it's usually a bad idea to have tomato leaves touching the ground. But what I will prune off is I will prune off the suckers and those kind of side shoots that can kind of take energy out of and away from the fruit production and into more vegetative growth of that plant. So I kind of use that to help direct the more of the plant's energy towards the developing fruit. And then we also have certain tomato varieties that can be more tolerant of heat, of excessive heat, right, than some others. So maybe if we're planning for a future year to grow tomatoes, we have some of these different varieties that include but are not limited to the Heatmaster, the Florida 91, and the Cherokee Purple. Now, the Cherokee Purple is an heirloom, and the other two, the Heatmaster and the Florida 91, are both hybrids. You know, so use your best judgment for what you want to use. If you want to collect the seeds and you don't want to inherit a breeding project or whatever, you know, maybe try the heirloom varieties and maybe some of these other techniques in combination with that. But those are some different options there. And then also, I just want to kind of bring up too, there's some possible room too for nutrient management, especially for large-scale growers where this is more applicable. It's probably worth your while to do a little bit more research on some of these different nutrients and how they can affect the growth and productivity of a crop in some of these different adverse conditions like excessive heat. We have certain nutrients that are very important, like calcium is really important for tomatoes to help prevent the blossom end rot. But then also potassium and boron may also be important for potentially making some of these plants more heat tolerant, right? And being able to direct more of that energy and more of the sugars into the fruit. So there's definitely room to do more research and experimentation on that front. But I just thought I'd kind of share that as a possible aspect to consider, especially kind of like what I said is when we experience those different temperatures, it can throw off the microbiology, right? And so maybe if it gets too hot, maybe potassium is in the soil profile, but it's not bioavailable to the plant because the microbes can't make it accessible to the plant, right? Thank you for checking out this video on tomatoes and not ripening. My tomato vines continue to fill up with green fruit, right? We accrue more and more fruit, and I feel like probably when it cools down, they're all gonna ripen at once, and I'm gonna have just a whole deluge of ripe tomatoes. And instead of being spread out throughout the season, I'm just gonna have to really hustle and figure out what to do with them at that point. But hopefully that will be a good problem to have. And in the meantime, thank you so much for tuning in. Feel free to join as a member, really helps out the channel, and subscribing doesn't hurt either. So thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in a future video. Take care.